This is the 2nd June 2021 in European history. A continent, well actually several continents, are literally bombed back to the Stone Age. Folk wanderings of displaced persons are moving around the landscape in numbers that haven't been seen since the end of the 30 Years' War, and really since the fall of the Roman Empire. Entire national populations are on the brink of starvation. One society emerges from the war, a military power, with an economy geared to war. Its people live a lousy living standard, but their military on land is second to none. The other is the only economy on Earth not substantively damaged by the Second World War, with the most powerful Navy and Air Force, a very powerful Army, and the only atomic weapons in the world. Yeah. Human nature says these two powers are going to start to fight. They are going to contend for control. That's just great power politics. And neither one of these powers is European. For the first time since the 1500s, the dominant powers of the world are only para-European. The Russians, the Soviets, are 1 foot in Europe, 1 foot in Asia, with a history that owes as much to the Orient as it does to the Occident. And the Americans, who come from England and the Western European tradition, but have morphed into their own distinct thing. But it's not simply great power politics, the jostling of dominance that exists on every playground. It's also a religious war, a theocratical struggle, because communism is a missionary religion. It does involve the spread of its faith by reason or force. Communism is very similar to the Islam of the 600s and 700s, a militant Islam bent on world conquest. And in the late 1940s, under Joe Stalin, they're ready to try it. A starving Europe and Asia provide immense possibilities for communists, because in times of crisis and starvation, totalitarianism is born, because totalitarians at the very least feed their slaves. So the emerging war between the United States and the Soviet Union has all of the intensity of any theocratic struggle or religious war. It begins before the end of World War II with the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. In 1944, nationalist Poles rise up, as I've told you, allies with the British, the Russians, and the Americans against Nazi Germany, and yet the Russians pause in their attacks, and where's Cadence? Pause in their attacks and let the Nazis slaughter them. And it has nothing to do with beating the Nazis or winning World War II. The Russian actions in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 are all about ruling Poland. Who will, excuse me, you're going to probably want to keep things inbound at that line. Who will rule Poland? Will it be the Russians or the Poles? I'm sorry, too. The Russians already laid stages for the destruction of Poland's native intelligentsia in the Katyn Forest Massacre. They don't want intelligent Poles. They want Polish labor. So they allow the Nazis a victory in the Warsaw Uprising for the sole reason of having the anti-communist Poles slaughtered. Their enemies fight one another, and then the Red Army continues its steamroller attack into Europe. Everywhere the Red Army goes, in addition to the mass rapes, there are communist regimes set up. There are two exceptions to this. The Austrian part of Germany is separated once more from the rest of Germany, and both the Russians and the Westerners pull out. leaving Austria neutral, what is called Finlandized. Why would they call it Finland? Well, let's see what the Soviets do in Finland. Finland, remember, had been attacked by Stalin in the Winter War. The Finns had creamed the Russians, but ultimately you can't have Bambi succeed against a Godzilla. So ultimately the Russians get some Finnish territory. When the Germans invade, the Finns push back to their pre-war border. However, as the Soviets move towards Finland, as they begin winning the war, the Finns themselves voluntarily pull back to the line that they had established at the end of the Winter War, and they wait. They also get rid of Marshal Mannerheim and the government that fought to reclaim territory. Basically, they do what a little puppy does when he realizes he's gone to the bathroom on the living room rug. Rolls over and exposes his belly as apology. Stalin looks at the puppy and says, okay. In other words, Stalin does not conquer Finland. He could, but he doesn't. And I think he doesn't because he realizes just how tough the Finns are, given how tough they were in the Winter War of 1940. He may end up getting Russian troops all over Finland, but they're going to fight a guerrilla war against him that would bleed Russia bad. So Stalin chooses to accept a neutral Finland. A Finland that will not in any way offend the Soviets, but also is not part of the Soviet Empire. The Russians accept this. This becomes eponymous with neutralization. It's called Finlandization, and Austria is Finlandized. However, the rest of the area in Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all become communist colonies, satellite states, of the Russians. Yugoslavia is an interesting case. When the Germans invade Yugoslavia in the spring of 1941, they unleash all the poison that exists in the mud of the Balkans. And the same forces that lead to ethnic cleansing and genocide in the 1990s in Yugoslavia come out in the 1940s. Some ally themselves with Germany, some ally themselves with Russia, and there is a fight between pro-German Chetniks and pro-Russian partisans. But the leader of the partisans is a Croat named Josip Broz Tito. And Josip Broz Tito is his own man. Stalin tries getting him assassinated because he's too independent for Stalin's life. Stalin's assassins are killed. Tito says, hey, Stalin, bleep! Yugoslavia liberates itself. They achieve what the Polish uprising in Warsaw wanted to, a self-liberation without Russian army forces. The Russians don't push it. Yugoslavia, for the duration of the Cold War, is a weird state. It's communist. Tito rules with an iron fist, but he's pro-Western. So you have a communist society in Eastern Europe, but in the terms of Cold War power politics, he is willing to support Western ideas because he doesn't want the Russians to take over Yugoslavia. However, the rest of Europe, under Soviet domination, begins to suffer. Now, Churchill is voted out of office between the defeat of Germany in May of 1945 and the defeat of Japan in August of 1945. In fact, he's at Potsdam meeting with Stalin and Truman to set up the post-World War II order. And he loses the election bad. Not so much because the British people don't like him, but because the British people are voting in their socialists, the British Labour Party. And in Britain, whichever party rules Parliament gets to pick the Prime Minister. So Churchill leaves. Clement Attlee, the leader of the socialists in Britain, comes to Potsdam. And Churchill goes back to writing and speaking, which is what he does when he's not leading Britain. He's an incredible writer, prolific writer, writes a lot of books. And if you ever want to give yourself a treat, find a book of history written by Winston Churchill. I don't think you'll be disappointed. There'll be solid history, but extremely well written. Anyway, President Truman is having a problem. The American people don't want to start thinking of their Russian allies as something to worry about. Americans are simple that way. When somebody's our friend, we treat them like a friend. When somebody's not our friend, we fight them. The Russians had been our allies in World War II. Why on earth should we start worrying about them now? So Truman invites Churchill to speak at a college in Fulton, Missouri. Truman is a Missouri politician from way back. That's where he's from. That's where his house is. So he invites Churchill to his home state. And at Fulton, Churchill basically gives the thesis statement of the Western side in the Cold War. He famously says, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the heart of Europe. Beyond that curtain are the storied capitals of ancient Central and Eastern Europe." And he basically says, who knows how long they will be in the darkness of communism. Churchill's speech begins to awaken the West to the Soviet threat. But Soviet actions in Eastern Europe also do this. You see, the West is weak. The former great powers of Western Europe are not able to even feed their own people, let alone do anything else. This provides massive opportunities. Even Britain is in a seriously bad shape. Britain, from a financial point of view, from an economical point of view, the British lose more by winning World War II than the Germans lose by losing World War II. I will say that again. Britain is more heavily damaged economically by their victory in World War II than the Germans are by their defeat. In 2 world wars, Britain has spent itself into penury to fight the Germans. After this second war, Britain is economically collapsed. And in a fit of stupidity, the American Congress, right after the defeat of Japan, says, "Hey, Britain, start paying back your debt." We had allowed the British to basically borrow unlimited amount of funds in order to keep them in the war. So the British need some help. They send their most famous economist, John Maynard Keynes, the founder of macroeconomics, the man whose plans were used by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the Depression to try to eliminate or at least ameliorate the poverty of that Depression. Keynes is well thought of in the United States. But Keynes's message is, first of all, Britain is still acting like the world's policeman. We can't afford to do that anymore. We're going to have to pull back from India. Americans will cheer at that. We're going to have to pull back from Palestine. We're going to throw it to the United Nations. Let them take care of the problem of the Arabs and the Jews. We're out. And we're going to pull back from Greece, which has a hot war, a civil war between communist guerrillas and a pro-Western government. You're going to have to take over. More than that, we need to reorient our economy to feed our people. We need more time. Please delay asking for us to start paying back these loans. After all, for a year, we stood against the Nazis while you were at peace. You see, and he didn't say this, but I'm going to. The only people on earth that should feel proud of joining the war, World War II, are the British, because they're the only ones to do it for the right reasons. Germany, Russia, Italy, Japan all engage in World War II for conquest. The French engage in World War II because they're desperate not to be left alone by the British. The British are the only, and we get dragged in kicking and screaming by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The British are the only people in the world that go to war to stop aggression, that go to war to keep other men free. That is incredibly honorable. And when France fell for a year, they fought on alone. Now we go back to what Keynes was saying. Since Britain fought the Nazis when America was not yet willing to, you kind of owe us a moral debt. Let's have you pay it off by delaying your request for the repayment of this loan. To which the American congressmen who don't like being told things like that say no. Keynes goes back to Britain, a broken man, has a heart attack, and dies. The British are going to be forced to repay the loan. They finally repay it in 2006. 2006. This is for World War II. They're paying money until 2006, which shows you the size of the loan. It was a bad idea. Now, Britain does pull back from India and Pakistan. Mr. Gandhi keeps starving himself. So fine. You want independence, India? You Muslims don't want to be part of India? We're going to send a guy in, and in less than a year, we'll draw a border between India and Pakistan. We'll leave, pull up your flags, and we're out of here. Millions, tens of millions actually, are on the wrong side of the border. I'll talk about the Indo-Pakistani problems when we talk about the Third World. But Britain leaves India. Britain also leaves Palestine to the United Nations. Hot potato, catch. And Britain is going to leave Greece. We are moving from Rule Britannia to Pax Americana. From at least the time of the 7 Years' War in the mid-1700s, the British Navy and Britain in general has been the hegemon of planet Earth. Now the hegemony moves to Washington, D.C. and the United States, and we bring about what is still, even though there are small and medium-sized wars, the American peace. For the moment, at least, it's still going on, and it will go on until we fight another major war. Hopefully not for a long time. The West is beginning to awaken to the threat, as Truman declares the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is this: we, the United States of America, will help anyone, anywhere fighting communism. We'll send you money, we'll send you food, we'll send you medical supplies, we'll send you military aid and weapons, we'll send you whatever you need. If necessary, we may even send in troops to help, but we don't want to do that if we don't have to. You fight the wars, we'll bankroll you. The Truman Doctrine is applied in Greece. The pro-Western Greek government gets enough wherewithal to crush the communist guerrillas, and Greece remains part of the West. But the rest of Western Europe is at the danger of having their own people go communist. Because, again, starvation in Italy, in France, in Western Germany, in the Low Countries, even in Britain. The British had rationed all food in World War II except bread, because they were an island and the German U-boats were sinking their ships. After World War II, the socialists maintain rationing. They maintain rationing for the same reason a lot of people still wear masks, because it seems like the right thing to do and because they've been convinced that good people wear masks. They were convinced that there's egalitarianism. Nobody gets to get fat except Winston Churchill in Britain because everyone's on rationing. So they perpetuate rationing beyond the war, but in 1947 they have to actually start rationing bread too, because their economy is shaking and falling apart. So the United States does something which, again, as Americans, you should remember with pride. And the next time somebody tells you, oh, America's just another empire, tell them about the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is named after American Secretary of State George Marshall. And what it is a plan for the United States, in simple terms, to take all the wealth that we've gained from being the only economy not bombed back to the Stone Age and the winner of World War II in terms of money. And instead of spending it all here, what we do is we spend it to rebuild Western Europe and Japan. We rebuild Germany, Holland, Denmark, Luxembourg, Norway, Britain, France, Belgium, Italy, Spain, Portugal, ultimately. They come later. In similar funds, we rebuild Japan. American money builds the auto plants that put Detroit auto workers out of work in the 70s and 80s. American money rebuilds the cities from the rubble piles that they were into new, shining, modern places. They rebuild the infrastructure, the rail lines, the bridges, the roads, the airports, the seaports. They rebuild the economy by allowing businessmen to ask for loans to build new businesses or to rebuild old ones. We don't do this in order to turn Europe into a colony. The Soviets turn Eastern Europe into their colonies, their satellite states. We don't. We rebuild a France that every chance it gets sticks it to the Anglo-Saxons. We rebuild a Germany that insists on going, it's pro-Western, but it's its own form of pro-Western. A Britain that doesn't help us out in Vietnam. We rebuild because we believe in freedom. And we believe that starving people are the only people who, aside from fanatics, are going to be drawn to the religion of communism. There's also the problem of what to do about the Soviet Union. So we offer Marshall Plan aid to the Soviets, to the Poles, and to the other peoples of Eastern Europe. Stalin is furious. This is going to make him look bad. Russians have lived a low standard of living since communism took over in the end stages of World War I. They live in horrible squalor, without any luxuries, unless you're a member of the party, elite. So this aid, if accepted, will make the Eastern Europeans look at their new cities and thank Uncle Sam. Bleep that. Stalin refuses to let any of his allies accept Marshall Plan aid. Again, the Soviet economy is oriented towards military spending, nothing else. But in the West, the cities are rebuilt, the economies are rebuilt, the Marshall Plan creates a garden of flourishing free societies that do tend to be pro-American and pro-Western, but not in lockstep, not like an empire. What to do about Germany and Japan in particular? These are both were both advanced industrial economies that are now destroyed, that had ideologies that led them each to commit horrible, heinous war crimes. How do you defeat an idea? I mean, this is a problem today. We're going to be leaving Afghanistan at some point, and when we do, the Taliban, thanks to the Pakistani army, are going to probably walk right in. These are the same people that hosted bin Laden when the towers burned. In Iraq, we built a democracy that is clannish and somewhat pro-Iranian, anti-American. But in Russia, in Germany and Japan, we did something special. Germany and Japan are thriving democracies, have been since the 50s. How do we do that? Well, first of all, we still have troops there. Now, in 2021, American troops are in Germany and are in Japan. Number two, they're there as earnest of the fact that we defend them both. Germany need not defend itself, although it certainly contributes to its defense. The Japanese need not worry about being alone, although they do have a strong military. We promise to defend Germany and Japan, and our nuclear deterrent is behind that. This will preserve Germany from Russia and Japan from China. We hope. If not, the Russians and the Chinese, if they go after Germany or Japan, will be tangling with us, which they probably, hopefully, don't want to do. We also invest massive amounts of time, effort, and money in the political systems in both countries. In Germany, there is a two-party system. The Christian Democrat Union, or CDU, is sort of their version of the Republican Party. Not exactly. The Social Democrat Party, SDP, is their version of the Democrat Party. Not exactly. Germany is a few steps to the left of us. But it basically is a system that works. In Japan, the Liberal Democrat Party has been the ruling party in Japan since, for the most part, since the end of the Second World War. And they're not called the Liberal Democrat Party for nothing. There are other parties in Japan that challenge them from time to time. We invest in these parties and we invest in their politics in order to prevent two things from happening, and I'll call it the rise and return of Japanese imperialism, the rise and return of German National Socialism. Now, in both of these societies, these World War II era isms of hate are still there. Like the bubonic plague waiting to hatch out again, they're still there. I don't know how many people are old-style Japanese imperialists in Japan. I don't know how many people are willing to give National Socialism another try in Germany. But there have been people since the end of the Second World War, and they're organized. Unfortunately, the European Union has really messed things up with their immigration policies by allowing tens of millions of military-aged men from the Middle East to swarm into Europe. They have destabilized culture, economy, and society. And a lot of people in these countries want to either follow Britain's example and leave the European Union, or at the very least they want to control their own borders, which they're not allowed to do under modern European Union law. This has brought about the rise not only of anti-immigration conservatives like President Trump here in the United States, but it's brought about a rise of parties that have elements of neo-Nazism. That's bad. We do not want a rebirth of National Socialism in the heart of Europe. We do not want a rebirth of the kind of self-immolating emperor worship that led to the kamikaze. We won't know about Japan because the Japanese are very good at keeping things close to their chests. They are very good at wearing a mask. When the American alliance is no longer necessary for the survival of Japan, they're going to go their own way, and we will see just how much they have absorbed the valuing of individual life and of democratic principles. Thank you for waiting.
As far as I've known, the Liberal Democratic Party is actually a conservative party in Japan.
Yeah. Well, by Japanese standards, it's conservative. But it's conservative in a
nationalist
Democrat way. Not so much nationalism. The Japanese are very careful about that. But with the rise of an aggressive China, nationalism is a reasonable response. So today's Liberal Democrat Party is much more nationalist than they were 40 years ago, say. And it's because of Xi Jinping in China.
40 years ago or 4 years ago?
40 years ago, when China was a threat, but wasn't the same kind of threat that exists today. So, there also are a group of anti-Western Germans called werewolves. And these werewolves are Nazis after the war who, during the period before West German independence, killed Germans who worked with the Americans, the British, and the French. The mayor of Hamburg, for example, an old Christian Democrat politician from before Hitler, became mayor of Hamburg again. His home was broken into and he was shot in his own foyer in front of his family by these werewolves. Ultimately, the werewolves are stamped out or go underground. But Germany and Japan are the success stories of democratization, of nation building. But it's an ongoing process. Western Europe is a chaos zone. Eastern Europe is a chaos zone. The Marshall Plan helped stabilize Western Europe. The Soviet Dominion helped stabilize Eastern Europe. But there's a problem that the Soviets have. West Berlin. When Germany is defeated in World War II, it is divided into three zones. A Soviet zone, a British zone, and an American zone. The British and Americans, in order to make nice with the French, cut some territory out of both of their zones and give it to France. So the French have a zone. Well, the capital of Germany is also divided into zones. There's East Berlin, which is Soviet. There's North Berlin, which is British. There's South Berlin, which is American. And like in Western Germany, France has given some territory from the British and French, from the British and the American zones. Well, West Berlin is an island of freedom inside an increasingly totalitarian Eastern Europe. So more and more talented people are leaving not only Eastern Germany, but Eastern Europe to go to the West, go to West Berlin, get a plane, fly out. This is an embarrassment. Also, it's obnoxious. See, here's the inter-German border, roughly between Western and Eastern Germany, right here. Here's Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone. So, the Soviets blockade Berlin starting in June of 1948. Nobody can travel to Berlin by land, by rail or road, by canal. The only way in and out of Berlin is in three narrow air corridors to the three small or medium-sized airports in Western Berlin. The Soviets say, fine, you want to supply millions of people in modern city by air? Do not stray from approved path, or we will have to shoot you down. So, we are faced with a challenge. Can we, with the Berlin Airlift, supply a city of tens of millions of people, or a city of millions of people, with everything it needs by air? We're talking about shipping coal by air to a city in the worst winter that Europe faces for 50 years. Winter of 19, it's just crazy. Shipping coal and aircraft? That's nuts. We set up the Berlin Airlift as Operation Vittles. Operation Vittles is run like a railroad. In the 3 airports in Berlin, we have a plane landing every 15 seconds at one of the 3 airfields. Now, these airfields sometimes are fog bound. You have to fly down through buildings. You got buildings here, buildings there, buildings there, buildings there, and then you got the airfield. So you got a plane laden with coal that has to go down and hit that postage stamp exactly. And a lot of Americans and Brits die flying food and coal and other things into Berlin. But it works. We don't go, oh, we stick. We stay. We supply the people of Berlin. We keep Berlin free by doing this. We don't go to war. We don't give the Russians an excuse to go to war. We just keep Berlin free. So in March of 49, the Soviets have to admit they failed. They were also trying to prevent the western zones of Germany from coming together as a country. They failed at that too. By the end of the Berlin Airlift, the foundations of the Federal Republic of Germany, that is West Germany, what is now totally Germany, are established, and the Russian zone is going to be run as a separate country called the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. So the Russians try and fail to do an airlift, but the airlift is what crystallizes a growing anti-communist sentiment. And in the United States, just before the airlift, we passed the National Security Act of 1947, NSC 47. The National Security Act of 47 transforms the federal government to fight the Cold War. See, when we start the war on terror, or actually when the terrorists start the war on terror with us, we established the Department of Homeland Security as a new bureaucracy to coordinate the war on terror. The way America goes to war is we establish bureaucracies to guide and fight it. So NSC 47, designed to fight a Cold War with the Soviets, establishes the National Security Council, the NSC, which is a collection of every intelligence agency that the U.S. government runs, military and civilian. And we're going to coordinate all of this activity. And during the Cold War, the president received at least one daily briefing from the National Security Advisor every single day. We also established the Central Intelligence Agency, which is our civilian spy network. It is our version of the Soviet KGB or NKVD, but it's forbidden from operating in the United States. The CIA is our dirty trick squad. It's designed to coordinate a lot of the intelligence we gather by spies and satellites, but it also has covert operations divisions. And we are going to overthrow governments in our fight to prevent communism from taking over the world. We also reorganized the military. Instead of a Department of War running the Army and a Department of Navy, the Navy running the Navy and the Marine Corps, we now established the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Pentagon to run the entire military. The Air Force is separated from the Army. The Navy and the Marines they work together, but they're separate armed forces, and there's the Coast Guard. So the U.S. military is very organized in order to set up the nuclear deterrent and to fight the Cold War under the new Department of Defense, which I think is a bad name. You don't win a war by defending. You win a war by attacking. But it is what it is. We also establish the most effective military alliance in human history, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, says if there is an attack by the Soviets or anyone else, an attack on one is an attack on all. Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, West Germany, France for most of the time, Britain, Italy, later Spain and Portugal, and Greece, and Turkey, Iceland, Canada, and the United States. An attack on one is an attack on all. So if a Soviet leader is tempted to seize Western Germany and try to bite it off, they're going to fight us day one. We have troops there. We have our nuclear deterrent. It's a tripwire that if they cross, they're engaged in World War III right away. NATO, after the fall of the Soviets, has extended eastward to include Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Hungary, a bunch of Eastern European countries. One reason why Mr. Putin hasn't gone into the Baltic states is because of NATO. Why he hasn't gone into Poland and White Russia, Belarus. Belarus is not part of NATO, but Poland is. And the temptation is once you start down that road, it's like, oh God, I hate pistachios, but I had friends who said, you can't just eat one, you got to eat more, or potato chips, or anything like that that you munch upon. Once you start munching on White Russia, on Belarus, can you stop? Or do you need to then bite Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and so forth? In any event, unlike the alliance systems that caused World War I, helped cause it anyway, NATO has kept the peace in Europe since 1945. It's the longest peace Europe has had since Roman imperial times. And that's because of the American involvement. Now, we set up SEATO around South Vietnam and Korea. That falls apart with the end of the Vietnam War. We set up CENTO in Iran. Now, Iran, I'm going to go a little early. A socialist government under Mohammad Mossadegh is elected in Iran. Mossadegh nationalizes the Iranian oil company and begins to tilt the country towards the Soviet Union, or towards at least a Finlandization. Iran had been pro-Western. The CIA establishes riots in the streets. We overthrow the guy, and we establish the young Shah of Iran, the Emperor of Iran, as the leader of a pro-Western government. For 25 years, except for Israel, Iran is our closest ally in the Middle East. They are rock solid, reliable. They build up a suburban, modern, comfortable Islamic middle class. And this scares the mullahs, the ayatollahs, more than anything else. Muslims living in the Western style, secularized, comfortable in the suburbs. Muslims who are not radicalized. That's what causes the Iranian Revolution of 1978, which overthrows the Shah. But that's another story for when we do the Third World. Ultimately, CENTO falls apart with the fall of the Shah. Now we're going to look at Asia. Late 1940s Asia. We occupy Japan. General MacArthur rules the place like a shogun. He establishes a New Deal-style center-left republic which lasts to this day. Japanese women are given the right to vote. Japanese peasants are given the right to vote. And in the first new post-war Diet, or Japanese parliament, a madam of prostitutes who has dirt on all sorts of powerful men in Japan becomes a member of parliament. And this scandalizes people, but MacArthur says, hey, she was elected. She worked for it. So Japan is occupied and still is very close to the United States. In China, somebody, I don't know if in this class, pointed out a question about this headline here. Red split with Japs. Just after we dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima, but before the Nagasaki bomb, the Soviets go to war with the Japanese. Before that, they've been neutral. They do so to try to get territory. The Soviets turn on their allies, the nationalist Chinese, begin supporting Mao Zedong's communist Chinese, and establish the groundwork for a communist victory in China in 1949, In October of 49, Soviet Union helps the Communist Party of China under Mao Zedong achieve dominance and power. Losing China is what it was called here in the United States, and President Truman, who is trying to plug holes all around the world, is condemned for not investing more effort in fighting the communists in China. But I've got to admit, the Chinese nationalists at that time were deeply corrupt, very ineffective, very inefficient. And I don't know if anyone could have saved China from the communists at that point. Anyway, when China goes communist, it's a huge deal. It's the largest country in the world by population. It's primitive as heck, but it is now communist. Also, the Soviets ruled in northern Korea and set up a communist puppet named Kim Il-sung. With the defeat of the nationalists, they go away from China to the island of Taiwan and set up government there. The Kuomintang, the Chinese National Party, no longer rules in Taiwan, but Taiwan is an independent country. Hear that, China? Independent country. Taiwan has never been part of the People's Republic of China. It's its own country. It's multi-party democracy. It proves that you don't need communism with Chinese characteristics, that the Chinese are perfectly capable of a democratic society, a very good and effective democratic society. Hong Kong was proof of that, too, until you slaughtered it. China. Taiwan was never part of the People's Republic of China. It was part of the old Chinese Empire until 1894-5, when it became part of Japan. And after the fall of Japan, it was its own country under the nationalists and now under a free democratic society. Okay, now we go to Korea. Kim Il-sung, dictator of North Korea, Soviet puppet, with Stalin's approval, invades South Korea in the summer of 1950, with the intent of unifying Korea under his rule. Stalin and Kim both calculate that the Americans won't get involved. We're a paper tiger. If you kill enough Americans, we'll go away. Why would Americans risk their lives to fight for Seoul, South Korea? Well, the United Nations does the one thing that, to my mind, justifies its existence. In the middle of 1950, the Soviets are boycotting the UNO because the UNO does not recognize Mao's Communist government of China. It recognizes Taiwan. As such, they're sulking like Achilles in his tent. When North Korea invades South Korea, the Americans bring a resolution that this is aggression and that the UN should stop it. The UN agrees. The Security Council of the United Nations, without the Soviet veto, votes to militarily intervene in South Korea. Now, at first, American forces are sent in piecemeal, but in Korea, where we have a map over here, the North Korean forces drive the Americans south into what is called the Pusan perimeter, and a small area around the only remaining fort nearest to Japan. But General MacArthur is given command of United Nations forces, and in a very controversial and bold move, lands amphibious forces halfway up the Korean peninsula at a place called Incheon. With his successful landing, all the communists in South Korea retreat to avoid being cut off by the Americans. MacArthur then invades northward to unify Korea under its democratic government. The Chinese communists say, if you go near us, we're going to attack you, but nobody believes them. And the fact is, China has not been impressive militarily in centuries. So we get up near the Yalu River border with China. Our Marines get as far north as the Chosin Reservoir. Before Thanksgiving 1950, the Chinese have infiltrated over 1 million soldiers behind our lines, and we don't really know it. Thanksgiving of 1950, they attacked from the hills, and the bloodiest retreat in American military history ensues, from the Chosin Reservoir to a city on the coast. The Marines are mauled. They are repeatedly encircled. They have to fight their way out. And then the Korean War becomes a stalemate along the 38th parallel, which was basically the original line of control between North and South Korea. At this point, General MacArthur wants Chinese troops from Taiwan, and he wants to use atomic weapons, and he's sick of President Truman and the United Nations holding him back. He publicly says to send American forces, to send American young men into battle, to fight for anything less than victory is to squander their lives. My government has allowed me to bomb the southern half of the Yalu bridges, which is the border between Korea and China. How on earth can you bomb half a bridge? Without modern laser-guided weapons, you can't. MacArthur is fired publicly by President Truman. This costs Truman big time. Now, to this day, it's a controversial thing. There are some who believe that in Korea, MacArthur could have gotten a victory over China that might have destabilized the Soviet Union. But President Truman was much more cautious. His goal was not to liberate Korea or win a war. His goal was to prevent World War III. As Truman saw it, MacArthur was risking World War III by fighting too aggressively. America has to do something it's never done before, fight to hold a line on a map. And Truman commits to doing that. He fires MacArthur. MacArthur goes to Congress famously saying, old soldiers never die, we just fade away. And for the next 3 years, we fight to hold a line on a map. And it's grinding World War I trench warfare style bloodletting. The Chinese set up a false peace process at Panmunjom, Korea, near the 38th parallel, in order to set up a peace process. But they'll fight for 6, 7, 8, 9 months over the shape of the table. Why? Because the Chinese are convinced if you kill enough Americans, we'll go away. And they try for 3 years. But in 1953, two things happened. Dwight Eisenhower is elected president, and the Russians and Chinese respect the man who defeated Hitler in the West, and Stalin dies. And with Stalin's death, victory in Korea, or peace in Korea, becomes possible. A ceasefire is established along a line very similar to the line at the beginning of the war. A demilitarized zone is established, separating the two forces, and that's all. We do not have peace in Korea. We're officially still at war with Korea, with North Korea, in defense of South Korea. But we have a ceasefire. And that ceasefire has been broken in little ways and in medium-sized ways many times. In the late 1960s, the Norks seized the USS Pueblo, an intelligence ship, and hold our crew hostage for over a year. In the late 60s, early 70s, they sent guys with machetes into the demilitarized zone to ambush American patrols and slice and dice on our guys. They're brutal people. If you ever see pictures of Panmunjom today, you'll see that all Allied troops, South Korean and American, wear sunglasses. Why? Because the Norks go into this whole staring thing. And what they're trying to do is get the Westerners to break the stare so that they can prove their dominance. But that can lead to fights, and we don't want to have needless fighting in Korea. But we're still officially at war. We still have tens of thousands of troops there. In the 1950s, American idealists say, you got two choices, the UNO or the H-bomb. Either we're going to get rid of this nationalism and have international organizations run the world, or the H-bomb's going to destroy us all. Luckily, neither of those two outcomes came about. Instead, the Soviet alliance and the American alliance fight a Cold War, a war for supremacy between freedom and communism, a religious war, a war to see who can give their own people the best standard of living, who can help the rest of the world most effectively. But neither of us want to go into full-scale war because it would be the end of everything. Now, in 1956, 3 years after Stalin's death, there is the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. For 3 years, there has been wrangling between Kremlin leaders. Kremlin is the castle that the Soviets rule from in Moscow. In 1956, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, emerges as the victor in these struggles. And Khrushchev in 56 at the 20th Party Congress shocks the Communist Party by criticizing Joe Stalin by name, by saying that Stalin led us astray. We need goulash communism. We need a communism that will give our people a decent standard of living. We need to show the world what communism can do for our people. So Khrushchev seems to be a liberalizing force. It's kept quiet, but it's still shocking that any communist would criticize Joe Stalin by name. And Khrushchev went after him. And it was controversial, and we'll see what happens as a result of that next time. Questions, comments, or thoughts? Okay. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
So, did you include the amount of people that died from the radiation of the atomic bomb did the firebombing in Tokyo still total?
I still think it does,
Okay.
but I don't know. Look it up.
Okay.
I don't know. I know that the firebombings killed more people in the short run, but if you count people that get cancer 5 years later, that's another question. And I don't know. So find out.
Okay.
I will say this. We proved that we're willing to spend over 50,000 American dead for solar. Hundreds of thousands of more. The Chinese do learn that lesson. Hopefully they'll remember it before going after Taiwan. Thank you. Have a good day.